Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding. My name is Erik Aker. My co-host Mike Mull is with me today. Hello, Mike.
Hey there.
How you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's a nice sunny day in San Diego.
You survived your drive back across these United States.
I did. It's a lovely country, but I'm glad to be back.
How did you occupy yourself driving across the country? You listen to a lot of music?
Yeah, these days I listen primarily to audiobooks,
Hmm.
but occasionally you kind of have to break that up. And so I throw on some music or maybe another podcast or something. But there were a couple of albums that I came back to pretty frequently on this trip. Um, very, very different in nature. One is the most recent album by Jamila Woods. She's a Chicago artist. Um, it's kind of in the pop R&B space, I guess. Um, this one is called "Water Made Us."
Hmm.
Um, it's it's I guess supposed to be a concept album about love,
Oh.
and so there's some like talky bits in there that I confess that I probably skipped after the first couple of listens, but um, there's some really good songs on here. Uh, there's one called the Tiny Garden, which is just a really well-made pop song, which I really like. And there's another one called Wreckage Room, which is kind of sad and simple, which I really
Oh,
like.
I like that title for a song, Wreckage Room.
Yeah, it's
What's the
great.
other? What was the other one you were listening to?
The other album is quite different. It's by a band called Year of the Knife. And the title is No Love Lost. And it's kind of in this space of metal that I am really enjoying at the moment, which is sort of somewhere between hardcore and death metal. Um, I really like this album. You know, when you're driving down the road in Kansas or wherever going 80 miles an hour, it's a good album to put on to just sort of keep you moving. It's only 20 minutes long.
That's
Uh,
it?
yeah. Sadly, this band was in the news also this year for they had like a serious accident in their tour van, and many members of the band had to go to the hospital. And I guess the lead singer was pretty seriously hurt.
Oh, geez.
I think they're okay now, and nobody was killed, but most of this recording was done before that accident. So I don't know. I don't know if they're back touring or back recording, but um, in any case, it's a good album. Um, really, one of those albums that's pretty hard and aggressive, but also still pretty musical, which I like.
Where'd you say they're from?
They're from Delaware.
Oh, I just went to Delaware. I've been listening to a pretty dancey pop music album too. I cannot escape the gravity of this album called Dawn FN by The Weeknd, and I'm a little conflicted about it. I think it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure for me. I just figured I'd give it a chance because Daniel Lopatin, the guy who records this One O Tricks Point, never produced it, and I thought, oh, I'm curious about this. But The Weeknd is like the most popular recording artist in the entire world. And
Yeah,
sometimes I have this tendency to think, well, is it going to be that challenging? If it's that appealing to that many people. But I can't stop listening to this album. It's weird. It's a weird one. It's kind of depressing dance music, which is, how like sometimes you get two flavors that are really great together, like sweet and sour or kiwi pizza.
hardcore and death metal.
Yeah, hardcore death metal, kiwi pizza, sweet sour, depressing dance music. It's like got this alienated feeling to it. It sounds real sci-fi. I described it the other day as it sounds like if Michael Jackson did the soundtrack for a John Carpenter film.
Yeah, I remember you saying that. That's a great line. I like that.
It's so bizarre. It is a weird, weird album. I'm listening to it. They've got this Dawn FM conceit, which is almost like an easy listening radio station that they've dreamed up. And it's like the radio station that when Otto's parents in the film Repo Man, when they get in the car, this is what's playing in the background, just complete alienation, easy listening dance music. It's subtle and weird below the surface. I don't know. I really like it. I'll tell you honestly, I wish I could stop listening to it. um, for our topic this week, Mike, you had said I want to do a true crime episode because true crime is how we're really gonna strike it rich and famous in the podcasting world. That's really where the money's at. What I've been told. I have to confess I've never really listened to any true crime podcast. I probably should not confess that. But you said you wanted to do a true crime episode, and even more than that, you said I have a true crime in mind. What was the true crime you wanted to talk about?
So the true crime I wanted to talk about was possibly the very first internet crime, the infamous, but now mostly forgotten Morris worm
And
from
this is the
1988.
anniversary of the Morris worm today, the day that we are recording.
35 years ago. Yeah.
So that's a good one to do today. It's a horrifying true crime, which I'm about to learn about. So normally in true crime, like there's a lot of murder and mayhem. And how many people died from the Morris worm?
I think the number is uncountable, but probably somewhere around zero.
Oh, okay. Okay. So it's a crime, but it's not a nobody died crime. It's kind of like in Repo Man, when one of the characters says to the other after they watch their friend get fried by the aliens in the trunk, let's go do some crimes. And the other guy says, yeah, let's go order sushi and not pay. It's kind of like that level
Yeah.
of crime is what you're saying.
Well, it was pretty stressful for some people, so I can't discount the possibility that, it might have contributed to a heart attack or something like that. So,
Yeah.
but I am unaware of that. So,
All right. Well, give me the background of the Morris worm, if you would.
so I'm going to read something from a paper that was written by a computer scientist named Gene Spafford. This is kind of the opening paragraph of his analysis of the worm. On the evening of 2 November 1988, the internet came under attack from within. Sometime around 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a program was executed on one or more hosts connected to the internet. This program collected host, network, and user information, then broke into other machines using flaws present in those systems' software. After breaking in, the program would replicate itself, and the replica would also attempt to infect other systems. Although the program would only infect Sun Microsystems' Sun 3 systems and VEX computers running variants of 4BSD Unix, the program spread quickly, as did the confusion and consternation of system administrators and users as they discovered that their systems had been invaded.
Ooh, that's interesting. So this is from a paper about the Morris worm. Their systems have been invaded. Wow. You started talking about this, and I found a report in the year following from the U.S. General Accounting Office, the GAO. Apparently, it was such a big deal that the government got involved and pretty much said, do we need to form committees and start investigating this? And the GAO put out this report, and there's a couple details in there I found interesting. They wrote that in November 1988, a computer program caused thousands of computers on the internet. And they even give it a little description. A multi-network system connecting over 60,000 computers nationwide and overseas to shut down. Do you actually remember this happening in 1988?
I do remember it happening. It was about 6 months after I started what was essentially my first real job. And I was fortunate enough to be, this was at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, which at the time was, really focused on providing supercomputing resources to researchers in the academic community and a little bit of commercial research as well. And so one consequence of that is that we were connected to networks because a lot of times the researchers had to access the Cray supercomputer over the network. And
but researchers only ECSD, or could people outside ECSD access it too?
Yeah, all over the country.
Oh, wow.
And as part of the supercomputer center program, um, the supercomputer centers, the NSF, National Science Foundation sponsored supercomputer centers, also formed what was called NSFNet, which was
Hmm.
kind of like an early backbone for the internet. Um, Keep in mind, this is 1988, so this is pre World Wide Web internet.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah,
and
the paper talks about how it was just like mostly academic institutions and defense department institutions, their networks, right?
yeah, and at the time, a lot of people probably wouldn't even have used the term internet. People might have referred to it as the ARPANET or the NSFNet or something like that.
So it wasn't all Cray at the supercomputer center. Like you guys had a bunch of computers that were on the internet, or
Yeah, so we had, obviously the Crays were the stars of the show, but you know, we had a cluster of VAX computers which essentially handled our networking, and we had relationships with Sun, and so we did have some uh, Sun 3 systems in the building. Um, Quite a few of us, we would connect to these systems using uh, Macintosh computers through like a VT100 terminal.
So it wasn't like a thin client. It was like you had your own computer and you would network into these other ones.
Yeah, so if we wanted to talk to the Cray or the VAX cluster, we would have started up a program that emulated VT100 terminal.
I have this kind of dumb image in my head when you say VAX computers of war games where there's like a wall of computers with flashing lights and stuff. And there's this weird gap in my brain between that war game style computers and institutional and defense and whatever. And like the Windows 3, like or Windows 95 machine that's on everybody's desk in another 10 years. Um, Was that what it was like? You guys had walls of computers, and then this Morris warn happens, and everybody's running around trying to figure out how to. What was it like there, and what was it like when this thing hit?
So we were pretty lucky at our facility because so the VAX computers were not like walls of computers with flashing lights. They were mini computers that were uh, made by Digital Equipment Corporation, and most VAX computers, including the ones that we used for our cluster, ran their own operating system, which was called VMS.
Hmm.
And so our VAX computers, which were running VMS, were essentially unaffected by the Morris worm because it was targeting Unix systems.
Right,
Um,
Unix only. Right, Morse worm.
yeah, and there were VAXs that ran a variant of BSD, which were targeted by the worm, but our VAXs were not affected. We did have some Sun 3 systems, and so which were infected, and which our system admins used for forensic purposes and helping out other people who were hit harder by it.
So this one, it kind of left an impression on you. Do you remember anything else about the day? Any particular impressions?
Well, I was a noob, so I wasn't deeply involved in it, but I do remember there being just this very significant buzz. You know, for one, this was really the first time in which something had been infected over the internet, and also it became a big enough story that it was actually in the news. So it was kind of an interesting situation to be in this facility that was being talked about on the news, and
Hmm.
this issue being talked about on the news. It was kind of one of those things where, um, you know, throughout the day, you'd hear new news come in. So, a lot of it was rumors and a lot of it was wrong. And then occasionally you'd hear a real thing that you didn't realize was real until later. But, I remember hearing about the send mail issue, and I remember hearing about the finger D issue. And I don't think it was on the same day, but I do remember learning, probably within a week of the attack that there was a particular person identified. Um,
Wow, within a week, you think?
Yeah, I don't remember the details of it at this, 35 years later, but I do remember it was pretty quickly that people started mentioning a particular name. And, um, it's ironic that the NSA was pretty quickly involved in trying to figure out what went on. Um, I don't know if we want to bring up why that was ironic yet, but
Well, you told me the punchline there. I want to look at the official timeline because you read the paper and it says on November 2nd, 1988, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then it's like on Thursday. I was like, well, wait a minute. So November 2nd, I guess, was a Wednesday. And then by next morning, less than 12 hours later, researchers at UC Berkeley had a patch for it. But not everybody applied that patch because they had, in a panic, disconnected from the internet.
right, yeah,
And then within 24 hours, it is estimated that 6,000 of maybe 60,000 computers on the internet were affected, but may not be 6,000, maybe 1 to 3,000. Um, Within 24 hours, there was a second patch published by Purdue researchers. So 24 hours later, you've got two different teams that have patched the bugs that were exploited. Interestingly, this paper that you told me about, the Spafford paper, published at the end of November. So it happens November 2nd. By the end of November, here's a paper. And then sometime very soon after it happened, Robert Morris, who released the thing, was actually indicted. And then he was convicted in January of 1990. So, like, November 2nd, this worm is released. January of the next year, the guy who did it is convicted. He didn't actually go to jail. I found out he was charged with fraud and deception, sentenced to 3 years probation, $10,000 fine, 400 hours of community service. And apparently that is the first sentence where they charged someone under this new law from 1986, the Computer Fraud Law. So he was the first guy who was charged with that.
right.
And then the GAO report came out in summer of 1989 or June of 1989. So it's like there's pretty short little timeline for this thing that affected the internet pretty widely.
Yeah, there's a year in there before Morris actually was indicted and prosecuted, but um, I I do believe that people knew that he was the key suspect pretty quickly. I think he also, confessed to it pretty quickly
Hmm.
when he realized it was out of control.
Mm-hmm.
So
The FBI has a little bit about that. Um, and we could talk about it if we talk about where this guy came from and what he was trying to do. But I wanted to look first at the attack. So the attributes that I found interesting, and I get often kind of confused with security incidents and viruses and worms and stuff. So from the paper, what you read, the worm, it collected host, network, and user information, and then it broke into other machines using flaws present in those systems. It used 4 different methods to try to spread itself. Exploits in fingerD and sendmail, and it tried to guess passwords. And then if there were computers which were trusted hosts, it would copy itself to those. There's a buffer overflow attack somewhere in there. It had this 1 out of 7 infection rate. So it would go to a machine and then 1 out of 7 times would make sure that it was running on the machine. But ultimately, what that meant was that the machines got reinfected or infected multiple times. Estimates are that 6,000 of 60,000 computers on the internet were affected, but that's from MIT. They had this 10% infection rate. Somebody else said, it's probably more like 1 to 3,000. 60,000 computers sounds like a large number, but minuscule, obviously, in comparison to how many machines you'd have on the internet today. Apparently, some institutions, mostly again research institutions connected, they just wiped their computers.
right,
Others disconnected from the internet for up to a week. And the GAO wrote that this virus was the first to spread over a network automatically without requiring other programs or user intervention to transmit it. And also to cover his tracks, Morris, he was a grad student at Cornell at the time. He hacked into a computer at MIT and released it from there.
right.
So some funny details in there, surprising details.
There's a great story that I heard Spafford tell somewhere else where not in his paper, but he talks about how he had a friend who was working for some secure government facility, and they actually had a button that would like explode part of the network to separate it from the outside world. And the Morris worm apparently like triggered the conditions to do that. And in the moment, this person decided, I'm just going to unplug the machine instead of blowing up the switch. So, um, but yeah,
That's
it was interesting. The fact that there were only 60,000 computers out there is probably hard for people to believe now. But this was before DNS, when people like actually wrote out route tables and stuff. So I used to joke when I was working in these days that you could literally visit every anonymous FTP site on the internet in probably a day. So
you could write a script to hit every single machine you could find. I mean, that's ultimately what
yeah,
the Morse worm really is, right?
yeah.
I wanted to ask about this reinfection rate thing because when I read that, I thought, well, that seems problematic. Do you know much about what the goal was with that? Like, why are we doing
Well,
this? Go ahead.
so my understanding of this was that one of the things that the worm would do is it would when it found a new machine to infect, it would see if it was already on that machine.
Hmm.
And so, the idea being that there was no point in infecting a machine that it had already hit. So, um, but one of the features that he put in, and Spafford describes this as the worm becoming immortal, was that in 1 out of every 7 cases, it would uh, not make that check. So, um, and the putative purpose was that he wanted to prevent people from stopping the worm by, if somebody could have potentially stopped the worm by putting code on their machine that simulated the worm and thereby kept his worm from infecting it. And so,
Hmm. He's explicitly trying to keep people from mitigating the worm.
yeah, it was theoretically a way to keep people from, uh, you know, convincing it not to spread. And the problem being that this this rate of 1 out of 7 was far too high, and so what was happening is the machines were just getting infected over and over and over again, and the load on machines would just go up to the point where the machines themselves were essentially unusable by the normal users.
Maybe so. I still a little bit um, vague on this point because let's say we have a network of servers. There's A, B, and C. We'll call those servers server A, server B, server C. Server A gets a copy of the worm pushed to it. It's the first one infected, we say. It does the 1 out of 7 check. Am I running? Finds it's not running, installs itself on the thing, and then tries to propagate itself. So then it goes to server B. Maybe 1 out of 7, it doesn't run the check. It propagates itself. Goes to server C, checks again, propagates itself. Is the problem then that B and C go back to A and try to propagate themselves? And there's a 1 in 7 chance that they might reinfect A. So it's like these requests just keep bouncing around the network.
So there's a slight detail there. So um, say the worm is currently already on server A,
Hmm.
and it identifies B and C as being new potential targets. So I think there's actually two parts to this worm. One that's kind of like the the vector that would start itself up through sendmail and then or R shell. And what it would do is it would say, um, "Have I already infected this machine?" And in the normal case, if it detected that it had already affected that machine, it would just stop and not do anything else. But 1 out of 7 times, it would say, even if I'm on this machine, keep going. And so the problem with that was that, a machine could be reinfected over and over and over again
Hmm.
because of these, immortal versions. And that's effectively what happened. And since he, didn't have a platform in which to simulate this process, the 1 out of 7 uh, number turned out to be way too high.
Yeah, I got to say, when I read that, I thought, I think I would have been scared to release that. Especially if it's like a demonstration, especially if it is, as he says, I just want to demonstrate how insecure your networks are. But there's a little bit of knife twisting. Not only do I want to demonstrate how insecure your networks are, I really, really want to make sure this thing lands there. The Wikipedia entry on this says that um, when they get infected multiple times, each additional infection slows the machine down, ultimately to unusability. It's the same effect as a fork bomb.
Yeah, I think another feature of the worm was that once that you were infected, it would occasionally fork itself and then kill its parent. And the point being that you couldn't just identify a particular process ID or whatever and kill it, because
Mm.
it would fork itself and create a new process periodically.
So I was curious about the other attribute, the buffer overflow, because I get a little lost thinking about those. I haven't really coded C professionally. I've done a little bit of C as a hobbyist. Um, but there are these exploits in send mail and finger, um, and there's a buffer overflow in one or both of those, and that was somehow exploited. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, so I think the buffer overflow was strictly in the finger daemon, finger
Do you
D.
know what? Do you know what the finger daemon does? Wasn't finger like who else is running on the machine? Isn't that what finger used to do?
Yeah, I don't even know if this is a Unix thing anymore, but um, yeah, it was essentially a thing that would tell you if a particular user ID was on a machine or who was on a machine, and um, so it wasn't, one of the most useful utilities ever created. But I think the send mail thing was just a flaw where it had this debug mode that would essentially run scripts for you. So
Hmm.
that was a slightly different thing. But
So you could use finger if we're both logged into the same server. I could say finger, and I could be like, "Is Mike on here?" And then I could send you messages, and they'd pop up on your screen like, "Hey, Mike, it's Erik. Let's code
yeah, and
together."
as I recall, you could you do finger and then provide a particular user ID, and it would give you information about that user too. Like
Mm.
groups and permissions and stuff like that.
Yeah, that sounds
Uh,
right.
but as I recall, there was a finger was calling a C system function that had a buffer overflow issue, and by sending a particular by connecting to the finger daemon socket and sending a particular payload, he was able to uh, effectively get a shell into the machine. And
That's the buffer overflow exploit. So,
yeah,
what are the technical details of how that kind of works? Do you think? I mean, is there a way to dumb it down?
um, I think so. So basically, when a function calls another function uh, in a C program, the one of the things that it has to do is it has to put something on the stack that says when that function I'm calling is done, come back to this location. So you effectively have to save the instruction pointer on what's called stack frame, so that when the function you're calling completes, it knows where to come back to by popping that address off the stack and returning to it. And also, if you in these functions, if you've set up a buffer, which is like a character buffer, that using what C calls an automatic variable, um, as opposed to like allocating it on the heap, that buffer is going to get put on the stack as well. So, say that you have a 500 character buffer, and you just say, character array 500 characters long. That's going to be on the stack too. So the basic idea of the stack overflow or the buffer overflow uh, attack is that you send an input such that it overwrites that buffer that you've allocated on the stack, and in the process also changes the uh, return address on the stack frame. And what Morris did was essentially he crafted a very specific payload to the finger daemon such that it would overflow the buffer and then make it return to a piece of code that he also put into the stack that would exec a shell essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that if you've at the time I was not a particularly sophisticated C programmer either, but I'd done a fair bit of assembly language. So this made a fair bit of sense to me because when you're writing assembly language, that's kind of the first thing that you kind of do is put stuff on the stack that you want to save for when the function that you're invoking finishes. And so I kind of understood how that was working.
Did you try to find any other buffer overflow exploits yourself? Did you go, wow, these are out there?
I didn't try to find any that I could exploit for, malicious purposes or breaking into systems, but I did experiment with trying to, get this to happen in a non-destructive way. It's not particularly hard to affect, and there are a lot of like hacker tools out there now, security tools that will actually help you do it if you want to try to. Like there are fuzzers that you can run against libraries that will, result in stack core dumps and stuff like that will help you find buffer overflows.
Hmm. Did it change how you wrote C or assembly after that, knowing that this was out there, that this is a possibility?
A little bit. I think everybody got a little bit more cautious about buffers, and one irony, I guess, is that people probably started putting buffers on the heap more often, but then they ran into issues with forgetting to free memory.
I had bad joke, which was, yeah, these problems never happen anymore, right? After this, they're totally gone now. 30 years later, no one ever has these types of attacks.
It is surprising that 35 years later, this is still a pretty significant issue. I did a Google search for, recent buffer overflows in 2023, and there have actually been some pretty high profile ones just this year.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was curious a little bit more about Robert Morris, the guy who did this, his intentions. Why'd he do it? I mean, he stated that he wanted to demonstrate the vulnerability of these networks. And, like one thing he demonstrated is a lot of people pick crappy passwords. If you've got a computer on the network, pick a better password. If I could just sort of guess it, that's a bad password. But maybe trusted network, trusted hosts and stuff. Learned a little bit about his background. So his father worked at Bell Labs when he was a kid, and at Bell Labs he helped design Multics and Unix. He was a computer scientist. He graduated from Harvard in 1988, June 1988, and then at the time of the attack, he was actually a grad student at Cornell. He was 23 years old. He was indicted and then convicted, as mentioned before, fined $10,000, sentenced to probation, 400 hours of community service. He got his PhD later in 1999 at Harvard. His research work has been on distributed hash tables like Cord. We actually read a Cord paper together, I think. I don't remember it really.
Yeah, I don't either, but we did a Papers We Love session on that, I remember.
Yeah. He's friends with Paul Graham. They founded a company. I didn't know this. They founded a company together called ViaWeb. They sold that to Yahoo for $49 million in 1998. He eventually became a professor at MIT, and he co-founded Y Combinator. Did you know that?
I did. That's one of the few things I did know about him after the worm.
There's a pretty good FBI report on this because I was like, how did they catch him? Because I was curious about like the forensic security stuff that would have gone on at the time. And I liked what I found out, but I was almost like disappointed that it wasn't some like hoodie hacker thing that solved where it came from. Here's from the FBI article on this. Shortly after the attack, a dismayed programmer contacted two friends, admitting he'd launched the worm and despairing that it had spiraled dangerously out of control. He asked one friend to relay an anonymous message across the internet on his behalf with a brief apology and guidance for removing the program. Ironically, few received the message in time because the network had been so damaged by the worm. Independently, the other friend made an anonymous call to the New York Times, which would soon splash news of the attack across its front pages. The friend told a reporter that he knew who built the program, saying it was meant as a harmless experiment and that its spread was the result of a programming error. In follow up conversations with the reporter, the friend inadvertently referred to the worm's author by his initials, RTM. Using that information, the Times soon confirmed and publicly reported that the culprit was a 23-year-old Cornell University grad student named Robert Tappan Morris. I guess he told the wrong people.
Yeah, I've heard this story about he told a buddy of his at Harvard who tried to send out this email to the people who would care about it, and like the email server was disconnected from the internet or something like that, so it didn't get out until days later. But yeah, and of course the punchline at the time was that Robert Tappan Morris's father, also named Robert Morris, was an employee of the NSA at the
Mm,
time.
That's the irony you referred to.
That was the irony I referred to earlier. And, so there were naturally a lot of stories at the time about how, that this was probably something that really originated in the NSA and somehow got out of the labs. And so,
The lab leak theory of the Morris worm.
right. So, the idea was that Robert Tappan Morris was just basically a scapegoat for this accidental leak from the NSA.
Did people believe that, you think? Did you believe that at the
I
time?
think a lot of people believed it. I don't think anybody with any sort of uh, inside knowledge of the worm believed that was the case. I think if you read Spaffer's paper and you look at the actual analysis of it, it looks like it's sophisticated, but it looks like code written by a grad student that was not deeply tested. So
That's interesting. Not deeply tested, like the 1 in 7 thing. This will probably
yeah,
work.
yeah. Like if this had been written in the NSA, they probably would have had, uh, you know, facilities in which they could have tested that or simulated that and dialed in the infection rate.
Mm. That buffer overflow attack in Finger D though, that was a 0-day, right? I mean, it wouldn't have been called a 0-day at the time, but that's a 0-day.
Yeah, I think that would have been considered to be an O-day at that in modern parlance. Uh, it's possible that other people knew about it, but it definitely wasn't something that people were patching.
So this is a thing that a grad student slapped together. Couldn't have come out of the NSA.
It seems unlikely. Spafford talks about how he builds this table of addresses that he could potentially infect, but he searches it and as a linear list rather than making like a hash table. So
Mm.
it's I think the NSA leak theory was pretty rapidly dismissed by people in the know.
That context is interesting. From reading the GAO report, there's this pervading worry in the author's voice throughout the report. Here's a couple lines from that. The lack of an internet security focal point created difficulties in responding to the virus. For example, problems were reported in communicating information about the virus to sites, coordinating emergency response activities, and distributing fixes to eradicate the virus. There's this worry How do we secure and regulate this massively decentralized thing? Right now, it's 60,000 computers. And in order to not be infected, a bunch of people just shut their machines off. How can we even tell them what to do? How can we fix stuff if the knowledge to fix it comes out of that same poisoned well? The worry it looks relevant but also quaint to me. It's massively decentralized. We don't know. It's kind of like this monster that's about to take off the internet. What happens if things go nuts on this system of interconnected computers? I kind of like that.
There was a lot of angst about it, but it does seem rather quaint in modern day.
I had a couple questions for you. One, does the punishment fit the crime in 1988? And what would we imagine the scope and punishment of this crime would be like today if this were pulled off today? What do you think? Did the punishment fit the crime in 1988?
There's a lot of debate about that, and I think it was ranged considerably. So there were people who felt that, you know, this was just a harmless prank. You shouldn't really be accusing this person of a crime at all. There's nothing in this malicious or intentionally malicious. It wasn't,
Wiping files or anything?
yeah, it wasn't attempting to exfiltrate information or wipe files or that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But, you know, the other camp, the people who spent thousands of man hours trying to figure out what was going on with this, and who lost access to their machines for in some cases for days, were maybe less sympathetic
Hmm.
and probably felt that it was at least, maybe he didn't want to send him to prison, but it probably was justified to uh, indict him on this charge.
Hmm. To prosecute. What about,
Yeah,
it's hard to imagine today. Maybe it's impossible to imagine what this would be like today because the internet's so vastly larger than I can even imagine.
yeah. Um, my sense is that law enforcement would come down pretty hard on somebody who did this now. You've made the point that this looks like a sort of a proto botnet, and obviously botnets have malicious intent. But um, if somebody were to build this, attempt this today, it would be hard to distinguish something that was a harmless prank from something that was an intentional denial of service attack.
Yeah.
So
People would probably be like, "Oh, I didn't." They would be very suspicious if you were like, "I didn't mean it. It was just to demonstrate how,
yeah,
how the vulnerabilities of your system." I'm curious. The last question I have for you is, this is the first like self-replicating virus type of thing. I mean, they call it a worm. The GAO says we're going to call it a virus, but worm is a word we use in the paper. Um, does this contribute to or set the stage for as a foundation of the kind of suspicion that we operate under when we use the internet today? Or was it still some time before people had any suspicion? I mean, is this where that suspicion kind of comes from? Or did it take a lot of other hard lessons before people started to become more suspicious about, I've got a computer and it's connected to a network and that is untrustworthy?
yeah. I think the latter is probably more the case. That time this happened, people were concerned about it, and I think it did lead to a lot of academic research on security topics that might not have happened otherwise. I think I've heard Spafford himself talk about how at the time people were more interested in things like formally verifying algorithms and so forth, and like cryptography.
Hmm.
That
The
was kind of
trusting trust paper was that an 80s paper, I think, or maybe earlier. Sorry.
yeah, I think that was 80s, but I think that was that the cryptography and verifying that cryptography was secure, I think, was kind of the focus of research, and I think
mm,
maybe this did, make other areas of uh, security research a little bit more fundable.
mm,
But I also get the impression that it was probably, you know, probably well into the 90s before people really started to think about this stuff in the way we do now,
Mm-hmm.
because that was the point at which people started stealing money.
Mm-hmm. There's real effects at that point. So I guess as a true crime goes, this is it's more like true probation. That's the story.
Yeah, but it's kind of hard to get a thrilling podcast out of
True
probation.
probation.
True
You know what is
probation.
thrilling? I managed to work in two, not one, but two Repo Man references into this episode. In a future episode, I'll try to beat that record, make it to
Mm.
three.
Is there any Wittgenstein connection here?
I don't think so.
I feel like we need a
there, there,
Wittgenstein
there,
reference for.
there probably is. I'm trying to repeatedly reference some other thing. All right. Thanks for teaching me about the Morris worm. It really is an interesting moment in the history of our field. And it's not one I would have known about if you hadn't brought it to my attention, I don't think.
Yeah, I guess one thing that kind of surprises me is how little cultural impact it has had. This one seems to have largely disappeared from the computer lore.
Well, good to know. It's a good lesson for us. Thanks so much. This has been Picture Me Coding. My name is Erik Aker, my co-host Mike Mull, and true probation aficionado. We'll see you later, Mike.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.